Hi, everybody. Welcome to this The Reading Agency Presents session that we have this evening. And thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to give us a minute before I do introductions because I know some people might have a little bit more difficulty gaining access. It might just be lagging a little bit. So we'll just give maybe a half a minute and then I will do introductions and hand over to Garry. Okay, everyone. So what I'll do is I'll begin. My name is Chris, and I work for the Reading Agency on the Reading Partners team, and we have the Reading Agency Presents series. So it's a virtual bi-monthly series where we present a lot of different themes and trends and a lot of different types of literature for you to kind of be exposed to and to learn about. So today we have the very talented Garry J. Shaw, who is an author, archaeologist, and journalist, and his articles have been published in the History and Travel magazine Timeless Travels, The Independent, Current World Archaeology, and the Art newspaper, and more. He holds a BA in archaeology and an MA and PhD in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool, where he taught Egyptian history. And he's also given lectures for Egyptology societies and museums, both in the UK and around the world. And he's also published scholarly articles on Egyptian history in peer-reviewed journals. So he'll be sharing insights about Tutankhamun as we celebrate his newest book, The Story of Tutankhamun, An Intimate Life of the Boy Who Became King, which, let me just maximize my screen again, is here. So I'll be dropping a link into the chat. And so if you want to go and have a look at that, do buy it and support Garry. I'm sure you'll all want to buy his book by the end of this session. I just also want to encourage you as well, if you've got any questions, any Q&As. If you've got any questions, pop them into the Q&A box, which is down on at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to pop any comments into the chat box, you can also do that too. If you want to also just let us know where you're joining us from, that would be absolutely lovely. So I'm going to turn my audio and my video off. I'm going to hand over to Garry. Take it away, Garry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's fabulous to be here. It's really great to have been invited and to have a chance to talk about Tutankhamun with you all. So thank you all for joining us and for tuning in. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen and go to the lecture. Okay. So, yes, my new book is The Story of Tutankhamun. And yes, it's a perfect time, really, I think, to be discussing this because it is now 100 years since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. The tomb was discovered in November 1922. So in the century since then, everybody really has got to know Tutankhamun's name. Everybody's heard of him. Everybody has seen the treasures, particularly the famous golden mask. Everybody's heard of the story of Howard Carter and the discovery itself. But after these 100 years, I think it's really important to think a bit more about, well, Tutankhamun himself, because everybody knows it's Tutankhamun's treasure, Tutankhamun's tomb. But when people often discuss him, it still often becomes more about, this made-up curse, for example. It always tends to go back to Howard Carter. Maybe we'll focus a bit more on how did Tutankhamun die? It's the gold and things like this. But really, the person at the center of all this, Tutankhamun himself, he's really become very secondary in his own story. And so I think after 100 years of analysis of his artifacts, and there was nearly 6,000 found in the tomb, nearly 6,000 objects, and also other artifacts found connected with Tutankhamun in his time, before the discovery of his tomb and afterwards as well in the past century. You can pull all this together and try and see a bit more about him, to try and put him back at the center of things. Because again, after 100 years, I think he deserves to have a bit more attention for his actual achievements and the time in which he lived and what happened during it. So that's the focus of my lecture, and we'll be focusing on who was Tutankhamun. So let's start I think, a good place to start about the time of his birth. And this would have been around about 1329 BCE, depending on the chronology you use. And this puts him, around about 1,000 years after the building of the Great Pyramid, and around about 1,000 years before the famous Cleopatra. So really in the center of what we call the Pharaonic era, the Pharaonic period. Now, this was an exciting time, a very tumultuous time to have been born. There was lots going on all around him at this time. Realistically, we can't say this for sure, but realistically, he would have been born at Tel El Amarna, which was the ancient city of Akhet Aten. Tel El Amarna is the modern name, and it's roughly in the middle of Egypt. This was a special place at the time of Tutankhamun's birth because, frankly, only a few years earlier, it didn't exist. There was no Akhet Aten or Amarna shortly before Tutankhamun's birth. The major cities were Memphis, which is in the north of Egypt, near modern Cairo, and Thebes, which was in the south of Egypt, which is now modern Luxor. Now, the reason that this city didn't exist before is because, well, nothing had been on this spot before, and it was specifically chosen because it was a site that had never been built on. Because the king at the time, King Akhenaten, who we see here in the center of the image, he had changed a lot of things. So he was responsible for the building of this new city in the middle of nowhere. And he was doing this because he wanted a new city from which to operate his court and in which to worship the Aten. The Aten was a quite obscure god in the Egyptian pantheon, but under Akhenaten, he'd been raised to the prime god, the most important god around in Egypt at the time. And you see this god on the top right of the image here. It's always shown, or almost always shown, as a circle, a disk. So it is the sun disk in the sky, and the rays fall down upon Akhenaten here. And this was a bit of a religious revolution. Akhenaten had basically turned his back on the traditional gods. Their temples had been closed, their finances, their assets had been redirected to the Aten cult. And so this was a major change to Egypt. Egyptians' traditions were being cast aside, pushed away, so that everything could focus on this one Aten god. And so this new city was being built partly to honor this god on a site that had not had any association with other gods beforehand. The temples that were being built there were also different from the temples that existed for traditional gods. Traditional gods' temples were all very dark, and the god was worshipped at the back in a very dark sanctuary as a statue. Here, the temples were open to the air so that the sun's rays could fall down on offerings. Akhenaten changed the art style as well. The traditional art was adapted to this unusual style that we see here in this image with Akhenaten, with these kind of thick thighs and a flabby belly and spindly limbs. These are all very distinctive elements of the Amarna art at this time. So religion, art, and the architecture of worship had also all been changed during this time. And it's into this that Tutankhamun was born, a very unusual time in Egyptian history. But it went further than that. It wasn't just simply the dismissal of these traditional gods. It was also that they were being attacked. So the temples were closed, but the statues of these traditional gods were being attacked by Akhenaten's followers across the country. Their names were being scratched away from monuments. And the one god that particularly faced the wrath of the followers of Akhenaten was Amun. Amun was the king of the gods in this phase of Egyptian history normally. The biggest temple in Egypt was the temple at Karnak, which is dedicated to Amun. It had the most staff, the most priests, the most income. This was all closed down, again, redirected to the Aten cult, and Amun was particularly the target of the attacks of the destruction of the statues and the destruction of his name wherever it was written down. And as you might have noticed, of course, the name of Tutankhamun includes the name of this god, Tutankhamun, Amun. But in his early years, when he was born, he was Tutankhaten, in honor of the Aten, the main god at the time when he was born. So Tutankhamun grew up during this very unusual phase. His parents, it seems, were Akhenaten, the king, which isn't too surprising, although there is sometimes a little bit of debate around that. Akhenaten, realistically, the father. And his mother, from DNA tests, appears to have been a woman called the Younger Lady. We don't know her name. We have her mummy. So the body was found in the Valley of the Kings, and the DNA results have shown that this woman was the mother of Tutankhamun, but also she was the sister of Akhenaten. So Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister. But we don't know who she was, as I say. We don't have her name. We know very little about her. From the mummy analysis, we can say that she was 25 to 35 years old at the age of death. And the mummy has a great smash to the left-hand side of the face, lots of damage. This would have been the cause of death. Whether this was an accident or whether there was something like a murder, we'll probably never know. But what we can say is that she probably died early in Tutankhamun's life. None of the artifacts in Tutankhamun's tomb mention his mother. And normally when a prince becomes king, you find that his mother is mentioned on at least some of the artifacts and monuments that he produces. And she isn't found anywhere. And so this suggests that she died quite early on. But one woman who would have been prominent in his early life was his wet nurse, a woman called Maya. It wasn't unusual for children of the elite to have wet nurses in ancient Egypt, and for princes and princesses too. And often these individuals formed a close bond with the prince or princess who would later become king. And if that person did become king, they were often highly honored. For example, Maya is seen here in the image on the screen. She had her own tomb built at Saqqara, an important necropolis, which is quite close to modern Cairo. And in this, we see Tutankhamun, older than he would have been, of course, at the time, sitting on her lap. And Maya is holding her hand up in a gesture of adoration. It shows the close connection between the nurse and the prince who became king. And it's also unusual because it shows physical contact between a king and a commoner. And this is something that we find with tutors and royal nurses. They have this right to show themselves in art or statues in contact with the prince if the person became king. So she must have been very important, particularly if his mother died young. She would have been even more important, perhaps, to him in his early life. His early life would also have involved toys and play. From the tomb of Tutankhamun, we find there's an ivory monkey with its arms that can move up and down, and a small bird that have both been interpreted as toys. There was also this fire drill that Howard Carter interpreted as a toy as well. You take the drill part and put them in the holes and you spin it and you create sparks. And it was found in a chest associated with Tutankhamun's early life. And so Carter, during the clearance of the tomb, thought maybe this could be one of his toys. From around age 4, as was normal for scribal students, Tutankhamun's education probably began. Because princes were very much educated in a similar way to scribes. And to reflect this time in his life, we do have certain items from his tomb for writing that reflect his earlier life and his teenage years too. So these you see on the screen here are scribal palettes. These are objects in which you could put your little reeds that you would use as your pens. And at the top of them, you see 2 circles, one on the left particularly. And these are little cakes of ink. Normally one red and one black that you could mix in with water and then do your writing with. So Tutankhamun had some of these found in his tomb. And this ivory bowl was also, it seems, connected with writing as well. It's been stained red with ink, which shows that it's been used a lot. And red was normally used by scribes when they were writing headings or important beginnings of texts, and also for correcting mistakes as well. Also, given the unusual time in which Tutankhamun grew up, this kind of new religion, this Aten-centric religion, casting aside the traditional gods, it's very probable that he would have received teachings from Akhenaten, his father. Akhenaten liked to be seen as a teacher to his court. Courtiers at the time referred to him as, teaching them, being a tutor to them. And there are hymns to the Aten which are in the tombs of courtiers at Amarna. And it's thought that maybe Akhenaten was the author of these hymns. So given all of that, and the fact that Tutankhamun would have been growing up at this time, it's very probable that he would have been taught specifically about the ways of the Aten religion and these new hymns and so forth from Akhenaten himself. And it's interesting when you put this all together, because it really shows that Tutankhamun at this point growing up, he would have had no experience of traditional ancient Egypt, the ancient Egypt that existed before this phase and after this phase when tradition came back. The traditions are involved worshipping the god Amun or the god Osiris, the types of rituals he performed in the temples as a prince or a member of the royal family for these traditional gods. He didn't, or he wouldn't have done any of this when he was growing up. So he's growing up at a time with a very specific worldview that's very much focused on this new Aten-centric way of looking at the world that Akhenaten created. There would have been some fun times as well. It looks like Tutankhamun would have learned how to ride a chariot from quite early in his life. And this was quite a trendy thing at the time for members of the elite to be doing. Everybody wanted to be seen as a charioteer. So the fact that he would have learned is not too surprising. We have an overseer of tutors from the time of Tutankhamun. So the man who would have been in charge of his education. He's a man either called Sennacherib or Senkhed, depending on how you interpret the text in the tomb. But in his tomb, you see an image of Tutankhamun riding on a chariot, seemingly with his tutor. So it would reflect this early point in his life when he was learning to ride. And even from the tomb as well, we find, at the tomb of Tutankhamun, we find chariots that look like they've had parts of their wheels replaced. And the interpretation here is that, well, it seems that he rode them so often, they had to be repaired. So they had to have pieces of the wheels changed. Shows that he would have seemingly have done this a lot as a hobby. And again, that's not surprising. It seems to have been a common thing for members of the elite and princes to do at this time in Egyptian history. On top of all that, from the tomb of Tutankhamun as well, we have objects that have been connected with charioteers. This is gloves. Gloves are very rare in ancient Egypt. In fact, there's only one example I can think of that shows a glove in a tomb, and that's roughly from this phase of Egyptian history. These are gloves that he would have worn when riding his chariot, holding the reins to keep his hands protected. On top of that, we also have socks that it seems that he wore as well when riding his chariot. These would have kept his feet protected when he was riding. If you think that if you're in a very lightweight chariot, hunting, chasing animals, a lot of dust and rocks and sand would have been thrown up, and these were there to help keep his feet safe, the same way that the gloves kept his hands safe when he was holding the reins. But this would also have been a time of, well, tragedy for Tutankhamun as well. These early years of his life were filled with deaths in the royal family. So the image on the right here shows his grandmother, Queen T. She died during this time. We know that 3 of his half-sisters, who were the daughters of King Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti, the famous Nefertiti, these died at this time. We have a quite obscure member of the royal family called Smenkhare, who might have been a brother or his uncle. He dies. And one of the other wives of Akhenaten, a woman called Kia, also died at this point too. So a lot of death going on around him. And whether he was close to these individuals or not, it's not so important here. The thing is that deaths in the royal family would have come with a lot of mourning and rituals, sadness at the court. And this would have surely had an impact on him as he was growing up, that there was death all around. Now, why were there so many deaths? We can only really guess, but we do have evidence for plague going around the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. So we have letters from the King of Cyprus to King Akhenaten saying that his copper mines were being underexploited because of a plague affecting the workers. But the same plague had killed members of the royal family in Cyprus as well. And other kings of the Near East in the Levant also mentioned this plague going around. On top of that, we have evidence for bubonic plague at Amarna itself, in the workmen's village there. And this is where the men who cut and decorated the elite tombs and the royal tomb lived at Amarna, at the very center of this new movement that Akhenaten was creating. And these individuals would have had connections with the elite, or at least contacts with the elite and the king and the royal family because of their work. And so you can see how it would very easily have passed through the population, the plague there. And so all of this together suggests, well, there was a lot of potential for plague to be the reasons for many of the deaths that were happening at this point. And then, of course, Akhenaten himself dies. He'd been king for 17 years by this point, and Tutankhamun would have been around 7 or 8. So he's still being educated, still learning the ways of this new religion. And again, still hadn't had much experience of the traditional ancient Egypt. What happens next, and this is a bit debated still, but it seems that Queen Nefertiti then becomes king as King Nefer-Nefru Aten. And this would have been an unusual time for Tutankhamun when he was growing up, because she seems to have come to a sort of compromise with the traditional religion, or the people who wanted to bring back tradition. Because although the court remains at Amarna, and although we still find the Aten mocking around as being worshipped, we find also traditional gods starting to find their way back into the art on royal artifacts. We find out it looks like she was planning on being buried in the Valley of the Kings, so the traditional burial place of the pharaohs, and not at Amarna, as Akhenaten had wanted. So there's something going on here. It's a very short phase. She seems to have only reigned for about 3 years. But if you look at it from Tutankhamun's point of view, who would have been educated very much in these Amarna-centric kind of thinking, suddenly he's being told, well, actually, you've been told to turn your back on the god Amun, and you've probably seen his statues being destroyed. But actually, now he's back. He's not so bad after all. And so I don't know, we don't have any evidence, of course, to see how he thought about this at the time, but it must have made him think, okay, what's going on here? So as I say, she only reigned for a short time, and then he would have become king. Tutankhamun would have been crowned. And this would have transformed him from a prince into a king. The coronation ceremony was a ritual in which the divine car of kingship, a divine sort of spirit, entered his body and made him a sort of semi-divine being. And we have certain bits of evidence that are associated with this statue in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or fragment of it. You see Tutankhamun's head with the blue crown on top and these fingers gently touching it. And in Egyptian art, this is typically part of a coronation scene. Normally you have the king kneeling in front of a god, and the god stands behind the king and he's gently touching the crown, kind of representing the crowning of the pharaoh. But more interestingly as well, we have these fragments of a ceremonial robe that were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, there's not much of it, but they're covered in these lovely little chevrons and geometric shapes, all picked out in these blue and green glass beads, and there's gold sequins. And there was a study done of this type of clothing as worn by kings in Egyptian art. And the study basically concluded that you only see kings wearing this type of clothing on 2 occasions. One is a kingship ritual that occurs 30 years after a person has been king. Tutankhamun didn't last that long. And the other occasion is the coronation. And so it seems very likely that Tutankhamun wore this outfit during his coronation. This is a very, very important day in his life. This might have been the robe that he wore then, or the fragments of it. So Tutankhamun becomes king. He's about 10 years old at this point. And as I say, he's now a semi-divine being. He is the intermediary between the gods and humans. And so he has a very important ritual and ceremonial role that he can't really escape. Now, I'm not saying a 10-year-old was making decisions or things like this, important government decisions, but there are certain things that, as pharaoh, he would have had to have been present at, particularly rituals involving that necessitated the presence of the pharaoh, and also ceremonies in which he would have had to be there to kind of represent, I suppose, the gods. So we know that normally every day there was a meeting with the royal court in which the most important members of the court came before the king and discussed the important matters of the day. Now, again, maybe later in his life, remember he reigned for quite a while. He reigned from 10 until about 19 years old. So in the early days, he wouldn't have been having much input. Surely later on he would have been doing. But at the earlier stages, it's probably more likely that he had to be there. Now, the Egyptians were very much focused on a concept called Ma'at. This was you can translate this as sort of balance, cosmic order, the correct way of doing things. And the king was a representative of this concept. And so these rituals are important because the king has to do these things correctly every day in the perfect way, because otherwise it upsets order. And so this is why he would have needed to be part of these ceremonies. Even if he just sat there and didn't say anything and just listened, he still had to do it. And some evidence represents this type of thing. So the famous crook and flail that we often see kings wearing in Egyptian art, these are symbols of ancient Egyptian kingship. From the tomb of Tutankhamun, we have one set that was made for a child and one set that was made for an adult, so when he was probably in his later teens. And so it reflects a continuity, him doing this job, these ceremonial appearances, and the types of items he would have held during this part of his life, this part of his work. Interestingly, we also have a scene from an official called Hoy, which shows his appointment to office. Hoy was an important courtier who was given the position of the king's son or viceroy of Kush. And this was the man who controlled the territory of Nubia for the pharaoh. So at this point in Egyptian history, the pharaohs had taken control of Nubia, the region to the south of Egypt. And so they'd appointed someone from their administration to control this region in their name. Now, Hoy was one of these guys. He was appointed to become the viceroy of Kush. Now, normally in an appointment scene, we find the king talking with the courtiers, the king kind of involving himself in the decision-making and discussing this process. But in the tomb of Hoy, we don't actually find this. And that's why it's kind of intriguing. The king is present, it seems. We see him sitting on the left. But he doesn't say anything. None of the hieroglyphs present the king doing or saying anything in this process. It's all left to the treasury officials. And so perhaps this might reflect a time when he had to be there, but he wasn't actually actively involved in because maybe he was too young. And talking about the court, there would have been certain individuals who would have undoubtedly been close to him, who would have worked to help him perform his duties, particularly when he was young. So one of these individuals is a man called Ai. He was a prominent royal advisor, a man who also served Akhenaten. He was also kind of connected to the royal family in that his sister had married into the royal family. So this man appears quite a lot during the time of Tutankhamun. And it might possibly be because he was helping the king perform his duties as pharaoh. For example, this is a drawing, but it's based on a piece of gold leaf that was found in the Valley of the Kings. It shows the pharaoh, Tutankhamun, in a smiting pose, about to bring his weapon down to the skull of this enemy, a very traditional image in Egyptian art that shows order defeating disorder. On the right of the screen, there's Ankh-Senamun, his wife. We'll come to her in a moment. But on the left, we see Ai, present at this ritual event. Now, it's possible that this and other bits of evidence suggest that he was accompanying the king in these types of duties. He was even given a particular title that was very unusual, that gives him the ability to take part in rituals, even though he's not, a priest. He doesn't have a priestly office. He was the head of the chariotry and a royal advisor. So there are certain indications that suggest that he was helping the young king. And of course, as I just mentioned, there is Tutankhamun's great royal wife, Ankh-Senamun, who's also a very fascinating person. She is Tutankhamun's half-sister, a daughter of Akhenaten and the famous Nefertiti. And like Tutankhamun, as I said earlier, Tutankhamun had originally been Tutankhaten as king. And when the return to tradition starts, he becomes Tutankhamun in honor of the god Amun. And she too had been Ankhesenpa Aten and changes her name to Ankh-Senamun. Again, focus on Amun. It seems that they were married at about the time of the coronation. So when Tutankhamun would have been about 10 years old, and she might have been 11 or 12. And I have to emphasize, this was very unusual in ancient Egypt. People did not normally get married this young. But the reason for this early marriage seems to be that, well, the queen was the female side of kingship. She had an important ritual role to play in the many, many rituals that pharaohs were also involved in. So the king and queen had to perform these duties. And so if there's a king, there has to be a queen. And she was extremely well qualified for this position because she'd been very much involved in the rituals that were going on under Akhenaten and Nefertiti from a very young age. She'd been part of the ceremonies that they attended. She'd watched this city of Amarna rise from nothingness, and then the end of this phase as well, when the return to tradition begins. So her life, in fact, was very similar, I think, to Tutankhamun's. Both had had a very similar, unusual upbringing in which they had experienced Egypt in a sort of non-traditional way, and were now being thrust into the center of a return to tradition. We see here quite a lot in objects from the tomb, particularly on the little golden shrine, which you see here on the screen, and in images like this that are from the shrine. So this great image of Tutankhamun with his bow and arrow, hunting in the marshes, shooting his arrows at birds, and Ankhesenamun sitting on a little cushion beneath him, handing him the next arrow for his next shot at the birds. So the king and queen spending time together. Or on the left of the screen here, where they're on a small boat, again in the marshes hunting birds. Or on the right of the screen, in another scene, where you see them with their arms interlocked. It shows the closeness of the royal couple. Again, perhaps the fact that they both grew up in quite unusual situation and then had to navigate a very unusual situation too in their teens might have brought them close together. And talking of the royal family, the royals that had died before Tutankhamun came to power were buried at Amarna. But when Tutankhamun came to power and things started to continue with this return to tradition, Amarna was being abandoned. It was at least definitely abandoned by the royal court. Other people continued to live there for a little while, but it seemed time that the royal family members that were left there to be removed and brought to the more traditional royal burial ground of the Valley of the Kings. So this is what Tutankhamun seems to have done from about the third year of his reign. He seems to have brought them to the Valley of the Kings. He had this very small tomb built, nothing special, some steps, a corridor, a small chamber. There's no decoration, but in there, he seems to have put important people. For example, this is the coffin, which is very probably that of Akhenaten. It was repurposed for him, but we can't be sure because someone later on, I think, shortly after Tutankhamun, there was attacks on this tomb, and the name and the face of the coffin were scratched off. The bones inside, though, have been DNA tested, and these are the bones of the father of Tutankhamun. So this body was placed in this traditional burial ground, moved from Amarna. Also, in there, we have the shrine of Queen T, a wooden shrine that has been gilded, where it has Aten-centric images on it. So Queen T, as I mentioned earlier, was Tutankhamun's grandmother, who died at Amarna and was buried there. But Tutankhamun seems to have buried her actually in another tomb in the Valley of the Kings, in the tomb of King Amenhotep III, who was Queen T's husband. So these are the grandparents of Tutankhamun reunited in death in the Valley of the Kings. Maybe this was a way of maybe trying to bring the traditional gods, helping them in the afterlife by placing them in a tomb that's surrounded with the decoration of the traditional gods. And Tutankhamun seems to have had a particular fondness for his grandmother. Their lives would have only very briefly overlapped, in fact. But in the tomb of Tutankhamun, we find these small interlocking coffins, very tiny. When you open them all, there was a lock of Queen T's hair within them. Seems to have been kept as a sort of heirloom or relic of his grandmother. Okay, but the main job, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, of Tutankhamun's reign was the restoration to tradition. And this seems to have started very early on in Tutankhamun's reign. From that very early point, we have this stele. It's called the Restoration Stele today. It was set up at the Temple of Amun at Karnak, modern Luxor, and it talks about the era before Tutankhamun and after Tutankhamun came to power. So before Tutankhamun came to power, the text on the stele says, it says the temples had fallen to ruin. They'd become overgrown with weeds. If You called out to the gods ignored you. If Egypt's armies were sent out to fight for Egypt, they were defeated. They weren't successful. But it's okay, because Tutankhamun was now on the throne and things had returned to normal. Things were prosperous again. Order had been restored. And this is all down to the king. And now this text seems to have been sent out to different places around the country, different temples, and would have been inscribed on the stelae, these stone stelae, which were erected in temple grounds at different places. So it's sort of him proclaiming these actions that would occur during his reign. Now, the interesting thing is these texts presented as happened. You know, the king has restored things to the traditional ways, but this text was made so early in Tutankhamun's reign that it's impossible to have happened yet. It's more that if you write something in hieroglyphs on a stele like this, and you put it in a sacred place, like a temple precinct, the words magically bend reality. They make what is written true. And so this is the aim of this type of magic. And luckily, this is actually what happened. So over the course of Tutankhamun's reign, as I say, from between the age of about 10 to about 19, there would have been a lot of craft activity, a lot of construction, a lot of art happening across Egypt, because the statues of the gods had been destroyed under Akhenaten. The names of the gods had been destroyed under Akhenaten. So you would have had to send out artisans all across the country to scratch back in or carve back in the name of Amun everywhere it had been destroyed. Statues that had been smashed to pieces were restored or had to be made from scratch. And so we find a lot of statues from Tutankhamun's reign of traditional gods. This one you see here on the right shows a small image of Tutankhamun, but behind him is the god Amun, this god that Akhenaten had hated, the god in that which Tutankhamun would have grown up being told to turn his back on. So it's makes you again wonder, how did Tutankhamun feel about this? It's effectively turning his back at this point on his own family's beliefs. Not only that, it was normal for divine statues of this type to have the idealized portrait of the reigning king. So not only is Tutankhamun making new statues, replacing ones that have been destroyed, but it's his own idealized face that is now the face of the gods. So for example, here we have Tutankhamun as the god Khonsu. Khonsu is the son of Amun and the goddess Mut. And so he's being presented here basically as the son of Amun. Again, how did he feel about this? Thinking about his upbringing and his education, this Aten-centric way that turned its back on these gods. We won't really ever know. And as I said, another important part of kingship, Tutankhamun's activities, would have been his presence at rituals and festivals. The kings traveled a lot. They traveled around the country, and there was lots of festivals going on at the different temples of the different gods all the time, and they had to be present at certain ones, particularly ones that involved the kingship rituals. So for example, here at Luxor Temple, which you see on the screen now, every year at Luxor Temple, there was an important kingship ritual in which the king himself had to go there with the gods of the nearby Karnak Temple, and he performed certain rituals that were believed to sort of re-energize this divine spark of kingship that was within him. So as you can see from that, it's not something that a high priest could do instead of him or in his name. This is something that the king had to do, whether he was 10 years old or 19 years old. So it's the type of rituals that perhaps you can imagine when he was younger, someone might have helped him with. Because as I said at the beginning, these rituals and ceremonies very much depended on doing the correct actions, saying the correct words in the correct order, in the correct way, for order to be achieved. To the Egyptians, the concept of art. And on these travels, Tutankhamun would have had some folding furniture. So from the tomb of Tutankhamun, we find this nice folding bed, which he could have taken with him when on his travels. We find a folding headrest for him to sleep on, which I don't know if you can quite make out, but the headrest itself has images of a god called Bes on it, and this god would have helped protect him from nightmares when he was sleeping. a folding stool as well. He also seems to have had traveling games. This is the game called Senet. There are various versions of Senet found in Tutankhamun's tomb, but a couple of them are like this one, in which there's a drawer built into the game board so that you can put the pieces inside. And one of them has a nice image on the side of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. So you can kind of imagine this being taken by the king on these travels to the different temples to perform these rituals. It's something to entertain himself with. You could play it with Ankhesenamun when traveling around. Also, we have nice processional chariots. Well, a processional chariot that was found in the tomb that the king and queen could ride upon when attending ceremonies and rituals and ride around together. This has long been called a processional chariot, I think even back under Howard Carter. But what was recently discovered, because discoveries are still constantly being made about these treasures, it was found that there was a sunshade that we've long known about from the tomb. Sunshade is exactly what it says it is. It's like something you could sit under with some fabric on top of it that would protect you from the sun's rays. But nobody until recently realized that that sunshade wasn't something you sat under when sitting on the ground. The sunshade was actually connected to this chariot. And so the sunshade would have kept the king and queen protected from the sun while they rode around doing their ceremonial duties. Also reflecting his rituals, we have nice items of clothing, or fragmentary items of clothing at least. So this is a fragment of a small fake leopard skin that, when you put it together, would have been child size. It's got a fake head as well, fake leopard head. Kings wore this type of clothing on certain ritual occasions. Normally, these are associated with mortuary cult, with funerals, but kings could also wear this on other occasions too. And the fact that it was made for him as a child, again, shows that he was performing rituals that required this type of clothing as a kid. Oh, it also had a fake claw. But when he was older, it was replaced with a larger, true leopard skin, again with a fake head. But it shows again that he was performing these rituals when he was younger, and also performing these rituals when he was older. And so they replaced the small size, child size items with ones that were adult size as he grew. Also interesting is this so-called stole, a sort of religious scarf that was found in Tutankhamun's tomb. And again, this type of item has been studied in art. And it was found through this study that in art, you only see kings wearing this when he's performing religious activities at Memphis, the city of Memphis. So for the Memphite cult, the gods Ptah, the creator god Ptah, for example, is the major god of this area, acting in the sort of role as a high priest. And so we can imagine now Tutankhamun wearing this type of item of clothing when performing rituals at Memphis. Okay, very quickly, I just want to take through some interesting objects from daily life. Incidentally, this is an image from the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb. This is the scene that would have met Howard Carter when he first peered into the tomb on the 26th of November, 1922, holding his little candle through and the wonderful things he saw. Well, these are the wonderful things that met his eyes. These were directly ahead of the doorway when he looked through. But if you look yourself at the bottom left of the screen, you'll see a little white box. Now, if we look at that, we know this is Tutankhamun's shaving box. How do we know this? Because it says so, the writing on the top. Unfortunately, when it was opened, it was found to be empty. And this is unfortunate. But it seems to reflect the time when Tutankhamun's tomb was robbed shortly after his burial. Probably within a year of him being buried in the tomb, robbers entered it, seemingly on 2 separate occasions, maybe more. And objects like were in this box, the metal shaving equipment, would have been good targets for these ancient thieves because they could take them, the metal could be melted down, and then it couldn't really be traced back to the tomb. But luckily, it seems that they didn't get rid of or didn't steal everything, because during the clearance of the tomb, Carter also found a nice copper blade on the floor. And later on, it was noticed that this blade and the dimensions of it and the description of it on the box, it all seems to match. And so this copper blade fits inside this box in one of the slots there. So it might have been one of the original items dropped by the thieves. Items of clothing are interesting from the tomb as well. This is called the sort of duck tunic, the flying duck's tunic. You can't really make it out, unfortunately, from this old photograph, but there are little bands across it in places which have lots of small ducks. And the ducks are running or standing still or about to take off or are landing. And it's interesting because you never see a king wearing this type of item in Egyptian art. You know, you never see an image of a pharaoh on a temple wall wearing a tunic decorated with small ducks. And so it's great to, as an insight into the idea that there was clearly a greater variety of clothing that a pharaoh could wear in his daily life, including tunics covered in ducks. Also of interest is this so-called, they call it the dalmatic tunic. Again, you can't quite make it out from this old photo, but the edges are decorated with sort of geometric shapes and sort of griffins and palmettes and kind of what's been interpreted as kind of Syrian imagery. And so the question is, was this a gift from the Syrian region? Because at this point in history, the Egyptians controlled a large chunk of the Levant, or was it made by Syrian embroiderers in working in Egypt who made this as a gift for the king? Can't really be sure. But it includes foreign iconography. So it's again an interesting thing that we don't normally see in art a king wearing. Lots of nice sandals and shoes were found in the tomb, and these have all been very recently studied. And some of them are quite fascinating because you can see that they've been used in life. And again, it's important to emphasize that although there are objects made for Tutankhamun that were of a ritual purpose, meant to help him in the afterlife, many of the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb were actually used by him in life. And so some of these sandals show little dents from the weight of his body on them. They have sort of remnants of the sort of natural oils that his feet produced while he would have been wearing them. So it makes a nice sort of connection with him thousands of years ago to the modern day. Loincloths, many pairs of loincloths were found in the tomb. And also many sticks and staves. And these are interesting because we know that the Egyptian elite held sticks and staves as symbols of power. It's not unusual to see a member of the court holding a stick in Egyptian art. It just shows that they are the powerful person there in that scene. But this was all cast in a new light when the recent CT scans were conducted on Tutankhamun's body. The CT scans seem to reveal that he suffered from a club foot and had other bone problems with his feet as well, which suggests that perhaps he had trouble walking. And so suddenly, maybe these sticks weren't just symbols of power, maybe he actually needed them to walk. And in fact, there's one very interesting stick in the tomb, a very boring one. It doesn't have, it's not made of gold, or it wasn't prettily decorated by the finest artisans in Egypt. It's just a simple reed. And what's interesting about it is that at some point, someone's added a little inscription on the top of it that says the king cut this reed with his own hands when visiting this specific location, I think somewhere in the marshes. And the question then becomes, well, what's so special about this? Why did he need this stick? And I suppose if you can potentially connect it with this the CT scan results, that maybe he had a club foot or problems walking. Perhaps he simply needed it when visiting this location. And anything the king touched was given a sort of divine power. And so things that the king touched like that were kept. And so clearly someone, one of the servants or whoever, took this after Tutankhamun didn't need it anymore, made a note about why it was necessary, what happened, and it was clearly kept in the palace storerooms or whatever until Tutankhamun's death, and then it was placed in the tomb among all these much more ornate sticks and staves. Okay, so also talking about the CT scan results, there's also been DNA studies conducted on Tutankhamun, and these showed that he suffered from various strains of malaria, including what seems to be the strongest, most powerful form of malaria you can get. And so this also sheds another aspect on his daily life, that malaria comes and goes, so that there would have been phases when he was well, but also phases when he would have been quite sick. And so this, again, it gives another insight into his daily life, that he would have had all these responsibilities, all this work to do, as as he grew up in his teenage years, but he would also have been quite intermittently quite sick. And then he dies at 19. And this, of course, leads to all these questions about why, how, and a lot of people have attempted to come up with theories. There are many theories, in fact. No, was he murdered? The evidence seems to suggest no, he doesn't seem to have been murdered. There's no suggestion from the CT scans or anything that there was any sort of murder involved. People have suggested maybe he was attacked by a hippo, an insect bite, a chariot accident, that he might have been kicked in the chest by a horse. All of these different theories have been put forward at different points. I guess the main theory at the moment is based on the CT scans and the DNA results, which suggest that multiple factors were involved in leading to his death. So the idea that he was quite weakened already by the malaria, the clubfoot and other bone problems as well might have contributed to this weakness in his body. And it seems, again, from these analyses, that he broke his leg shortly before his death, probably just a few days. And this would have been quite a serious break. In fact, it might have led to septicemia. And again, all of this together would have left him probably too weak to recover and could explain why he died at 19. From looking at the break and things like this, it looks like it would have been so severe that, yes, it's not something the Egyptian doctors could have really done anything about. They couldn't really have helped him. Okay, so just to finish off quickly, you then, after Tutankhamun's death, King I comes along briefly. So I was the advisor I discussed earlier on. And after him, because his reign is only short, we have a man called Horemheb become king. This was a military general, another important man who helped Tutankhamun during his reign. But when he becomes king, he starts erasing Tutankhamun's name from his monuments. For example, the restoration stele that I was discussing earlier on, this great monument that describes the great acts that Tutankhamun did to bring back the traditional ways of ancient Egypt, traditions that he, of course, didn't know, had never experienced, was now responsible for fixing. But Horemheb now comes along and puts his name on this. He even removes Ankh-Senamun from this monument too. And it's the same with many of the statues. The statues and monuments and inscriptions that Tutankhamun had put up around Egypt as part of this grand restoration, Horemheb usurps, and the kings after him also continue this theme, usurping it. What seems to have happened is that there was a decision taken that these kings of Amarna, including Tutankhamun, were to be erased, that this entire era were to be forgotten. So Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, they were being wiped out of existence. Their memory would be forgotten. But it's also unfortunate for us, because I think, again, that Tutankhamun is famous these days for his death. Why did he die so young? His treasures and so forth. But if his name had survived on these statues more clearly, if it had been more obvious, all of this restoration work, maybe he would have been more famous without the tomb. Maybe he would have been more famous for the art that was produced during his reign, for his restoration efforts. But all of this was taken away from him in death when his successors decided to usurp his monuments, to remove his name and put their name in his place. So Horemheb takes responsibility for the return to a tradition that had actually happened under Tutankhamun. This happened all over Egypt. Horemheb replaced Tutankhamun's name everywhere he could find it. But one place he couldn't reach was the tomb, because it seems that very soon after Tutankhamun's burial, as I said, there was very shortly after the burial, there was some thieves that entered the tomb. But shortly after that, there was a great flood, a sort of downpour, a great storm in the Valley of the Kings. This great storm, this great downpour created a flood through the valley, and it all converged on pretty much the spot of Tutankhamun's tomb. And it's not just water, it's bringing down flood debris. Rocks and all sorts are being thrown down, and they all get left on top of Tutankhamun's tomb. Then the waters dissipate, and it left a sort of very thick layer of ground. I think it's almost like cement, almost concrete-like. So hard, so difficult to dig through, that it completely covered up the tomb entrance. So Horemheb's artisans couldn't get in the tomb to destroy it or to change the names or to attack the imagery. It was left as it was. And in fact, very soon afterwards, everybody basically forgot it was there. Not long afterwards, you have Ramesses VI, a later king, having his tomb built nearby, and the workmen digging his tomb build their workmen's huts on top of the spot where the tomb of Tutankhamun was. And they probably didn't even realize that Tutankhamun's tomb was beneath them when they were building these huts from which to base themselves while digging this other tomb. So it seems to have been completely forgotten. And it remained that way for thousands of years, right up until November the 4th, 1922, when Howard Carter's team, excavation team, first found the first steps leading down. So it remained untouched for all of that time. So just to conclude then, who was Tutankhamun then? I hope you agree with me after this lecture that there's more to him than simply a gold mask. There's more to him than simply this talk of of a curse that never existed. There's more to him than the story of Howard Carter and the discovery. This was a young kid that grew up in very unusual circumstances at a time of quite religious turmoil and revolution, who was then thrust into the center of power and was kind of tasked with the responsibility of, or at least being the figurehead, or at least initially, of the movement to bring back a traditional ancient Egypt that he himself had never known, one that he had never grown up in and had to adapt to, I guess, as he was going along. And so, had to then perform rituals and so forth. And then after all this responsibility, dies young, and all of this is taken away from him. The achievements of his reign were taken away and usurped by others. So there's a lot of intriguing things that went on during his lifetime, which I think deserve more attention. And so I hope, again, you agree with me that we've done that today. And so after 100 years of, since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, I hope now we can bring him back to the center, stop him being this secondary character in his own story, and bring the focus back to him, to Tutankhamun himself. And if you enjoyed the lecture, thank you very much. This is the book, The Story of Tutankhamun. It's out now. Please buy a copy, and I hope you really enjoy it if you do read it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Garry. Thank you. I just popped a link as well into the chat. So please do, if you're interested, do support indie bookshops as well, where possible. There's a bookshop.org link there. And I just want to say thank you from everyone at the Reading Agency and also for everyone here. I know we were all fascinated by that. Thanks, Sylvia. We don't have time for many questions. So what I was going to ask is, if with your permission, if it's okay, if I put a link to your Twitter, if anyone has any specific questions, and
Sure.
they can ask you on Twitter. I'm sure most people will be on Twitter. Also, failing that, there is a link. I mean, they could possibly contact you by email, but preferably, I suppose, on Twitter is probably better.
Twitter's good. Twitter's great. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Sure.
If you're on Twitter, so I'm just going to pop that in there now. If you want to give Garry a follow, if you've got any questions there. I'm going to ask one question that's like my favorite, which was, where's it gone? Was there something new or exciting that you discovered as you were researching and writing the book?
Well, for me, I mean, so during the research, the interesting thing for me was constantly, coming across these little fragments of information that people mention in these kind of academic publications, and seeing how it could really fit into the overall story, and thinking, oh wow, that really brings out this bit of his life. Some of the things I mentioned in the talk, like the fact that there are fragments of the robe that he might have wore during his coronation. You're kind of going through the research and kind of trying to pull together, like, how can I really tell the story of Tutankhamun's life? What elements survive that let me bring a bit of the character back? And then you find things like that, these elements of clothing that he might have wore, or that the stick, for example, that I mentioned, that seems to be a very boring stick with an inscription saying that he touched it himself, or like the duck tunic. It's things like this that you come across when researching that add a lot of more character and let you kind of provide a bit of insight. So it was those bits and pieces like that that I found really exciting. Anything from the tomb that showed signs of usage, things that you can say, oh wow, that he must have touched this at some point during his lifetime, and it's there's still signs of that today, thousands of years later. They were the exciting bits for me when doing the research.
I think it was fascinating as well, just to add that the sort of reframing of Tutankhamun and sort of thinking of it in a different way, because I do think a lot of people think of that in sort of, I know myself, I think of Tutankhamun through the eyes of the discovery of his tomb by Howard Carter. And obviously this month, 100 years ago, which was remiss of me not to say that in the introduction, that's kind of how this chat was framed, which is great, and it was a great discovery, but it kind of still takes away from him, and it kind of takes away from aspects of the story that we kind of got to see today in your presentation, which was absolutely like fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Sorry.
I was going to say, yeah. So as I say, yeah, and that's great. And I think it's worth emphasizing that these objects and other aspects of Tutankhamun's life over the past 100 years, research has been ongoing. And as I say, that's the thing I found exciting. Looking at these research papers that academics have produced in the decades since, and everything that's gone on, and saying, wow, that's fascinating. I need to put that in the story because I don't know how many people know about that, or the latest research that's been going on into the objects in Cairo and all this. Like, for example, I mentioned this sunshade they discovered, fits on top of the chariot, this processional chariot. I mean, that was really fascinating. This research, is being conducted and it was published. I'm like, well, okay, I've got to include that. And so piecing it all together and emphasizing that scholars are continuing to research all of this. It's been continuous, and it's fascinating, the bits and pieces they've been discovering that tells us about his life.
Was there an area in particular in sort of ancient history that you have yet to explore that you'd really want to kind of write about?
I'm sure there's plenty of different aspects of Egyptian history that I would like to focus on, and also, other areas in the world too. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm fascinated by pretty much all history, all archaeology. I mean, I think there are later phases of Egyptian history that will be definitely worth delving into in more depth. The late period in particular has a lot of hundreds of years after Tutankhamun, but there's a lot of excitement going on that in those phases, which I think could be explored a bit more. But yeah, we'll see. There's a lot of interesting historical subjects out there to discuss and write books about. So yes.
We've gotten some great comments as well. I'm going to read out a couple of comments, but I'm just going to pop a survey into the chat for those of you that are still with us and that didn't have to pop off at 8 because we've got a couple of minutes over. I'm also going to send out an email. And the importance of this feedback is that it basically lets us kind of see sort of what kind of events you want to hear about. Like this event, I'm pleased to say, was really, really well attended, which is fascinating. And I'm able to say that, with Garry here, which is great. And then all these lovely comments. But it really helps us kind of to do that and really, shape this program. So please do, if you're able to, if you have 5 or 10 minutes with a coffee, maybe tomorrow morning before work, or if you're sitting at the library or sitting at your office desk and you have time to do that, or on the tube or whatever, and it would be very much appreciated, and it will go out in an email as well. This by Wednesday next week, this talk will be on YouTube, and it will be, we just have to wait for it to be subtitled for accessibility. And once that's done, I'll obviously be circulating that as well, and that'll be promoted across social media. If you've got any friends that you think would be interested, I think I can definitely say that my manager is actually really looking forward to watching this back tomorrow on our lunch break. So if you have any friends of that you want to share that with, absolutely please do. Please do support Garry, and please do, just reading this comment, thanks for a great talk, very interesting and informative, an amazing period in ancient Egypt's history we may never have known about, but for Carter's long, hard work to find Tutankhamun, from Phil. But we've had so many amazing comments, and thank you so much for your time, Garry. I'm sorry that we can't answer any more questions, but if you do have them, the link to the Twitter is there, the link to the survey is there. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Garry?
No, I was just going to say thank you very much for having me and for giving me the chance to give the talk. So, and thank you to everybody who tuned in and who watched on YouTube as well. So thanks for having me.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Tongue tangled, sorry, I didn't even have to do the talk and I'm tongue tangled, which is really bad. Let me try that one more time. Take two. We can edit that out of the YouTube video, hopefully. Yes, so thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for coming along, for taking time out of your evening to join us, and thank you so much again, Garry. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you with us this evening. Stay safe, everyone, and have a lovely evening. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.